If you ever wondered who Heracles was, and if he was in fact a real person, you're not alone. I too have thought the same since a young child, and now honestly I would say Heracles, in my opinion, is a mythological figure with the tradition probably going back as far as the Neolithic Age, and carried into the Bronze Age through oral tradition. And eventually these myths were written down in Mesopotamia during the end of the 4th and into the 3rd millennium BC. And with the rise of Sargon of Akkad and Hammurabi in Sumer and Babylon respectively, we get the first epic literature tradition, starting with Gilgamesh and Enki and Nana and Dumazet, to name a few. And this early Bronze Age myth base of the Near East re-emerges after the late Bronze Age collapse in the archaic Iron Age of the Levant and Mediterranean, with the Hebrew and Greek religious works of the Old Testament and Homer and Hesiod, which I have argued and made videos before linking the Hebrew and Greek mythos back to the Sumerian or ancient Near East religious epics and poems to show they are fundamentally the same. Whether the mythic tradition started in Sumer is kind of impossible to prove at this point due to the fact that you run up against like the beginning of writing itself, right, with cuneiform and hieroglyphics coming out of Mesopotamia. But I believe the tradition is probably much older, like probably adapted and reinterpreted through the ages, like before the Bronze Age and during it. And with the Sumerian tradition, we see leaders like Sargon of Akkad become deified themselves in correspondence to other royal dignitaries and leaders at the time, as well as also becoming part of the myth-making process itself. There's a poem called the Curse of Akkad that has made Sargon almost like a demigod, like Heracles. So yeah, it's possible there was like a great warrior or leader who became mythified into like a great god or hero-like figure. But no, I don't think there was a Greek guy clubbing animals roaming around the countryside of Mycenaean Greece. But through the analysis of the Sumerian and Babylonian epics, one could likely find an analogous figure to Heracles, but the likelier or easier connection would be found in the Bible. So in doing so and analyzing the texts of the Greek and Hebrew mythology, I found that the demigod Heracles is the same as the biblical patriarch Jacob. And this is kind of a profound statement to make, right? And I thought about this for a while. Before embarking on this project to closely study both these figures, Jacob and Heracles, you have to take kind of like a 30,000 foot view approach to just decide whether we're even talking about the same caliber of figures, right? Are they equal? Are they of equal importance to their respective culture and religion? And with Jacob and Heracles, I think you can say yes. For either, we're talking about a patriarch, a pillar, and one of the most recognizable characters within each respective religious pantheon. And this is without even going into the specifics of their character and lives within the text. And once one begins looking more closely at each character's life and mythology associated with them, along with the themes and symbolism that each carry as a totem, you begin to form a pretty solid argument to link and equate Jacob and Hercules as identical characters, most likely originating from a common Near East mythological tradition. When comparing both Heracles and Jacob and their births, and a background into their parents and ancestors, right away it's pretty obvious in my opinion that we're talking about identical mythologies and identities. When talking about either Jacob or Heracles, this birth and early life is especially important, revolving around this sibling rivalry born out of a twin birth, and with the order of birth separating the child of God and the child of a mortal man. And the thing about Heracles and the Greek and even Roman religion, the myths are not set in stone, right? No pun intended, whereas the Hebrew Bible has a biblical canon. And for the purposes of my analysis, I consider Homer, Hesiod, and Apollodorus as authorities and canon for Greek theology, and I think no one would see issues there. And it's with this body of work, the Iliad and Odyssey of Homer, Hesiod's Theogony and Shield of Hercules, as well as Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, that I use to compare and contrast in this effort to show and prove that Heracles is the same as Jacob. And with Heracles' birth, we see the same story with all three authors, really, with Homer giving his account spread throughout a couple books in his epics, through the narrative of the poems, whereas Hesiod and Apollodorus have given a more straightforward and detailed account. And when you take from each and sum them up, you have this picture that's remarkably similar to Jacob and the story surrounding his birth from Genesis in the Old Testament. So let's start with the narrative and story behind the Greek Heracles' birth. Before Heracles was born, Zeus swore a prophecy that a descendant of Perseus would rule over Argos, and according to Apollodorus, Perseus had 6 sons, with Alcaeus, Sthenelus, and Electron being the most relevant to the story behind Heracles' birth and to this video. So, from Apollodorus, Book 2, Chapter 4, Section 5. And Perseus had sons, by Andromeda. Before he came to Greece, he had Perseus, whom he left behind with Cepheus, and from him it is said that the kings of Persia are descended. In Mycenae he had Alcaeus, Sthenelus, Helios, and Mestor, and Electron. If you go through the family line of Heracles, you'll see Perseus was his great-grandfather on his father's side, with Perseus having a son Alcaeus, and him giving birth to Amphitryon, the father of Heracles. But in reality, Amphitryon is not Heracles' father, right? Because it was Zeus who coupled with Alcmena, the mother of Heracles, bringing forth a Demi-God child, Heracles, into the world. And the union of Alcmena and Amphitryon resulted in the mortal Iphicles being born, the twin brother of Heracles. But even though Amphitryon wasn't Heracles' true father, Heracles was still related to Perseus, where he was his grandfather through his mother's side, Alcmena, who was the daughter of Electron, one of the 6 sons of Perseus. So once again, to be clear, Perseus is really Heracles' great-grandfather through his mother's side of Alcmena. And this is important and because of the narrative of Heracles' birth and the omens surrounding it. I think Apollodorus gives the simplest account of the story, where Sthenelus, another one of the 6 sons of Perseus, has a son himself, Eurystheus, who is going to be Heracles' uncle. And Eurystheus is involved in the story and important because he's the one who fulfills the prophecy of the descendant of Perseus ruling over Argos. And it's because Eurystheus is born before Heracles. And ultimately it's because of the jealousy between Hera and Zeus. From Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, Book 2, Chapter 4, Section 6. Sthenelus had a son, Eurystheus, who reigned also over Mycenae. For when Heracles was about to be born, Zeus declared among the gods that the descendant of Perseus, then about to be born, would reign over Mycenae, and Hera, out of jealousy, persuaded the Aletheia to retard Alcmena's delivery, and contrived that Eurystheus, son of Sthenelus, should be born a 7th-month child. So Heracles' uncle Eurystheus fulfills the prophecy of Zeus through the schemes of Hera, because she was upset with Zeus about his philandering, and in particular his love affair with Alcmena, right, the mother of Heracles. So Hera delays the arrival of the Aletheia and the midwives, where Aletheia is the childbirth goddess who ensures a quick and painless childbirth, and because of the delayed and prolonged childbirth of Alcmena, Eurystheus was able to be born before Heracles and Iphicles. Therefore, he was the child to be born to a son of Perseus that day, like the omen of Zeus stated. And through the long and painful delivery of Heracles, it's that we get this association with the word labor for birth, and this sense of an agonizing or strenuous activity. The native word in English for toil is work, but the word labor is used as well, right? And if you look up the etymology, it comes to English from Old French and all the way back to Latin, and most likely because of Hercules. And the first hit on etymology.com for labor is relating Heracles, right, in his 12 feats. But also it has like connotations relating specifically to childbirth. And back to the narrative of Heracles. Hesiod in his work, The Shield of Heracles, gives his account of the conception and birth of Heracles. So let's read. Alcmena, the daughter of Electron, gatherer of the people, she surpassed the tribe of womankind in beauty and in height, and in wisdom. None vied with her of those whom mortal woman bore of union with mortal men. Her face and her dark eyes wafted such charm as comes from golden Aphrodite, and she so honored her husband in her heart as none of womankind did before her. So Hesiod describes Alcmena as beautiful, and she has the epithet neat-ankled daughter of Electron, which are details that are important when comparing to Genesis and the story of Rebekah, the mother of Jacob, right? This epithet, daughter of Electron and neat-ankled, as well as her remarkable beauty, right? These are three significant details that we need to remember. Furthermore, into Hesiod's Shield of Heracles, he describes how Zeus beds Alcmena while her husband Amphitryon is away at war, and thus siring Heracles. But the father of men and gods was forming another scheme in his heart, to beget one to defend against destruction, gods and men who eat bread. So he rose from Olympus by night, pondering guile in the deep of his heart, and yearned for the love of the well-girded woman. So in one night Zeus shared the bed and love of the neat-ankled daughter of Electron, and fulfilled his desire. In the same night Amphitryon, gatherer of the people, the glorious hero, came to his house when he had ended his great task. And Heracles is a demigod, which is why he's so famous, right? He's the son of Zeus, who bedded Alcmena, the wife of Amphitryon, while he was away at war. And by the time he got back, she already was pregnant with Heracles. And nevertheless, Amphitryon made love to Alcmena too, right after Zeus, and as soon as he arrived back from war. And this is how we get the twin birth of Iphicles and Heracles. So let's read further into Hesiod. He hastened not to go to his bondsmen and shepherds afield, but first went in to his wife. Such desire took hold on the shepherd of the people, and all night long he lay with his modest wife, delighting in the gifts of golden Aphrodite. And she, being subject in love to a god and to a man, exceedingly goodly, brought forth twin sons in seven-gated Thebes. She bore Heracles through the embrace of the son of Cronos, lord of dark clouds, and the other, Iphicles of Amphitryon, the spear-wielder, offspring distinct, this one of union with a mortal man, but that other of a union with Zeus, leader of all the gods. And Hesiod describes how Heracles is different from Iphicles, and that he, once again, is a demigod, but also how he describes the difference is similar to Genesis 25, where the omen goes that the older will serve the younger, right? Where Jacob the younger ends up taking the older Esau's birthright and blessings. And Hesiod gives his take, which is similar to this. Here, let's read. Though they were brothers, they were not of one spirit, for one was weaker, but the other a far better man, one terrible and strong, the mighty Heracles. Switching over to the narrative behind Jacob's birth, let's take a look at the book of Genesis from the Hebrew Bible, where the birth of Jacob resembles many of the aspects of Heracles' birth, which I just discussed, and it bears out in an analysis of chapters 24 through 25 of Genesis specifically. Like the story of Heracles, where it starts off with the prophecy of a descendant of Perseus who will rule over Argos, Genesis has the same kind of background story as well, where we can imagine this through the covenant of Abraham, right? And the Lord of Yahweh, where Abraham and his descendants are said to be chosen by God to inherit Israel. And this descendant is Jacob, right? And his 12 sons, the tribes of Israel, who would eventually travel to Egypt and make it out and return to Israel through the leadership of Moses and Joshua. But here, let's go to Genesis. In Genesis 24, we have that oath being stated, so let's read. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household in my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me an oath, saying, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, so that you can get a wife for my son from there. And the son of Abraham is Isaac, right? So Isaac, the son of Abraham, doesn't have a wife or a child, and is growing old, and Yahweh says to Abraham, I will send an angel to help bring a wife for Isaac. So Abraham sends a messenger to the land of Nahor, where his brother lives. And the messenger goes to a wellspring or a water fountain and meets a girl, Rebekah, there, and remarks how she's beautiful and it said she's a virgin. And interesting, she also has this epithet of a daughter of Bethuel. And Rebekah will eventually become the wife of Isaac. But before that, she brings the messenger back to her house to stay and meet her family. So continuing on with Genesis 24. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. The woman was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever slept with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. She answered him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son that Milcah bore to Nahor. And she added, We have plenty of straw and fodder, as well as room for you to spend the night. And relating this back to the story of Heracles, his mother Alcmena we can identify as Rebecca, and like Rebecca, Alcmena is described as beautiful by Hesiod. In addition, Hesiod uses the epithet daughter of Electron when describing Alcmena, which resembles the usage of a similar epithet in Genesis used to mention Rebecca as daughter of Bethuel. So we have daughter of Electron and daughter of Bethuel. Furthermore, Apollodorus also explains that Alcmena is a virgin, like Rebecca is said to be in Genesis, where Alcmena has to remain a virgin until Amphitryon has returned from war. And going further, we can identify Isaac as Amphitryon, Perseus as Abraham, this patriarchal figure to whom his descendants are prophesied by God to rule and inherit a land, and like Alcmena and Amphitryon, Isaac and Rebekah are related to each other in a very close way, with Rebekah being the daughter of Bethuel and granddaughter of Milcah and Nahor. And she's related to Isaac through Nahor, who is Abraham's brother. And by the way of the Greek myths, Alcmena is the daughter of Electron, who is the son of Perseus and the brother of Alcaeus. And the relationships are incestuous, where like men are marrying their nieces, so it becomes kind of ambiguous and confusing to match some of these people, like who exactly Nahor and Milcah is. And that's not the point I'm trying to make. I wish to argue whether Jacob and Hercules are the same myth, and not get bogged down in trying to match every single person in the story, and especially those who don't even drive the narrative or just kind of part of an epithet or placard. And again, these problems stem from their incestuous relationship where people are uncles and grandfathers at the same time, so there's a lot of trouble and ambiguity trying to draw a correct family tree. So it's best to just take away that Rebecca and Isaac are related in a very intimate way, in the same way Alcmena and Amphitryon are. Anyways, back to the narrative of Genesis. Rebecca invites the servant of Abraham back to her house to meet her brother Laban, where the servant explains to Laban that he is a messenger for Abraham, a relative of theirs, and asking for Rebecca to go marry Isaac. And remember, the whole point of the trip of the servant was for the Lord's angel to pick a wife for Isaac. And let's go further into Genesis. The young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Now Rebekah had a brother named Laban, and he hurried out to meet the man at the spring. And we can interpret this scene where Laban is introduced as the brother of Rebekah, as Eurystheus being born before Heracles, where we can equate Laban as Eurystheus, and this comes with some forehand knowledge of the book of Genesis and the story of Heracles, where both Jacob and the story of the Greek hero, both of them have to perform labor for an older relative or uncle for a period of years, with Laban being the relative in the Hebrew myths and Eurystheus being the uncle in the Greek myths. And this introduction of Laban before the introduction of Jacob and him hurrying out before the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah is symbolic, right, of the birth of Eurystheus before Heracles. And Genesis goes on with Rebekah going with the messenger to meet and eventually marry Isaac. Then the servant told Isaac all he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. In this moment where Isaac finally gets to wed Rebekah and consummate the marriage after her being brought by the servant, can be viewed as the moment where Amphitryon finally makes love to Alcmena when returning from war. But she already has been deflowered, right, by the chief god Zeus, who we can think of as like the angel of the Lord, or Yahweh himself, right? The servant of Abraham meeting Rebekah at the wellspring and then going back to her house is like this metaphor for the affair of Zeus and Alcmena. And therefore, right, we can say the angel of the Lord or Yahweh is the father of Jacob. Not Isaac, right? Identical to kind of the situation with Zeus being the father of Heracles, where Isaac is like Amphitryon again, father to the mortal twin child, Iphicles in Greek, like his Hebrew counterpart, Esau. And in Genesis 25, we get to the twin births of Jacob and Esau, who we can understand through the Greek mythology as Heracles and Iphicles, respectively, being born from the same mother. So here, Genesis 25. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife, because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And Rebekah has a difficult and painful pregnancy where the babies Jacob and Esau are wrestling in the womb. And this is reminiscent of Alcmena, who has a prolonged pregnancy that's painful because Hera, out of jealousy, has delayed Eileithyia and the midwives from attending to Alcmena. And as a result, Eurystheus, right, is born before Hercules. And going further into Genesis, the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." And this part is very similar to Hesiod's Shield of Heracles, where he describes the birth of the demigod Heracles, saying, "Though they were brothers, these were not of one spirit, for one was weaker, but the other a far better man, one terrible and strong, the mighty Heracles." So Alcmena and Rebekah carry twins, with one being of mortal father and the other of the chief god, and the demigod will be the more powerful than the mortal child, right? Which we know means Heracles and Jacob are the chosen children, prophesied and sired by God to become great men. Certainly more than their mortal counterparts. And more into Genesis 25. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Jacob being born second, and grasping at Esau's heel, reminds me of Hesiod describing the mother of Heracles, Alcmena, as the neat-ankled daughter of Electron, and perhaps this is where we get this association with the heel for Jacob's name, and through the epithet for the mother of Heracles, Alcmena, neat-ankled daughter of Electron. Apollodorus, in his account of Heracles' birth, gives an additional detail that Hesiod and Homer don't mention, and that Hera sends two snakes to kill Heracles in his crib when he was an infant, and Heracles ends up killing a serpent in each hand. And Apollodorus claims this is how Amphitryon knew Heracles wasn't his son, and that Heracles was the son of Zeus. And we can interpret this through the symbols, right? One of the snakes, a symbol of chthonic cults of Minoan Crete, but also of Yahweh from the Hebrew Bible. And second, the two snakes, which we know of the number two, or the double birth or twin birth of both Jacob and Heracles. And for the Greek birth, the orders are switched, right? Where the son of God, Heracles, is born first. And in Genesis 25 of the Hebrew Bible, Jacob, the son of Yahweh, is born second. And reading the account of Apollodorus just from the symbols, we have a chthonic serpent and the number two, which is like the Bible, right? Where Jacob is the number two born and a son of Yahweh, the Semitic chthonic God, who we can associate with snakes. And this goes back to Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden, where we get introduced to the symbol of a serpent, and it's linked with the heel, which we know is the name of Jacob, right, to grasp the heel. From Genesis 3, so the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." So again, we have this symbolic connection with the number two and snakes with Jacob, and this also includes, right, the association with heels from Genesis 3. And we can link this to the two serpents that Heracles kills in his crib. And I think it's clear that Apollodorus has made this connection in his rendition of the myth of Heracles' birth. And Iphicles was a participant in the Caledonian boar hunt, which is how we know Esau as like a good hunter. But I'll save the childhood and later years of Jacob and Heracles for a separate video, and we're just going to worry about the birth in this one. So just by analyzing the Greek anthology and Hebrew Bible in regards to only Heracles' and Jacob's birth and their family history, one can easily build up a substantive argument for taking them as identical mythological entities. And the goal isn't to crush people's childhood fascination with Heracles, but to understand these characters as mythic and formulaic, that are created consciously with the audience in mind, right? As a tool to socially engineer virtues of an ethnic or political group. And that can be either good or bad, right? And that's why it's important to understand these thousand-year-old characters and themes, to apply them to modern day, where they're just as salient, right? The themes are just as salient as they were in the Bronze Age. And we might think of Heracles and Jacob as almost opposites in some respects when comparing the two, and perhaps we have a case of JM, right? And its application with regards to two different audiences, with the Hebrew Bible intended for Jewish people and the Greek myths of Hesiod intended for a Greek audience. So the Greek audience would be more accepting of Heracles' character of strength, power, and violence, as opposed to like the conniving Jacob. And when we think of Heracles, we'd probably consider him to be more like Esau, if it's just going by his assumed physical appearance of this like hulking brute of a man with a club and he's wrestling lions with his bare hands or something, right? Whereas Jacob is described as someone content to stay at home and among the tents. And that's like nerdy by today's standards. And like he eventually becomes a shepherd and manages Laban's flocks. And he uses like this technique to breed spotted and brown sheep to cheat Laban out of his flock and essentially ruin his flock by diversifying it. And Jacob is like a modern day Silicon Valley technocrat. Or maybe better, he's like the ADL, or Jacob and the ADL might not seem so like intimidating physically, but in reality, they're like very strong and their strength is unparalleled, right? To censor ideas and people. And that's probably the best way to think of Heracles too. Just think of the ADL and all they have like done to rid the digital countryside of all these so-called monsters or like racist hate groups. It's the 12 labors of Heracles and like right to censor Facebook, take over Twitter, demonetize people off PayPal, try to try to take out PewDiePie. The list goes on. I mean, of their toils to get people scrubbed off the internet. And that's what the Hebrew mythology moralizes, right? And it happens over time in phases. And Genesis is just the beginning, where by Exodus you have the great censoring of the first commandment, and it's basically just shut it down. And Moses is a direct descendant of Jacob. This is their goal, right? To shut it down. And with that in mind, we need to consider the analogous character of Heracles and his role in the Greek mythological universe. Well, that brings us to the end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative.